For most of my life, I've been a fan of metal. Twisted metal. The car combat game nobody believed in. But today we're going to look at the real story, from inception to collapse, to better understand just what made the whole series so great. And I'm starting this story with David Jaffe. In 1993, 23-year-old Jaffe was living in Los Angeles, California in pursuit of the typical Hollywood career, wanting above all else to tell a story. He was young and driven, hoping to become the next big-shot writer-director. But while he waited for his dream to come true, he needed money, and so took a job as a game tester for Sony. He found himself testing licensed games based on movies like Cliffhanger, Last Action Hero, and No Escape. And by all accounts, he massively disliked what he was seeing. Because in other words, Jaffe was up to his neck in the same kind of cash grabs that later made angry video game nerd Internet famous for calling out how irredeemably terrible they were. But somehow, even while being forced to stare at squished down, pixelated versions of Stallone and Schwarzenegger day after day, he realized video games could also be used to tell a compelling story. Now, Jaffe very quickly started rising in the gaming industry. He went from testing to design, and from designing games to directing games. All in less than a year, which is pretty impressive for someone who initially had no real goals within that line of work. Unfortunately, he was a bit of a dick about it. As he himself admits, he thought directing a game was like directing a movie, and so he acted the way he thought all the famous movie directors did. Basically, it was his way or the highway. In 1994, this came to a head on, of all things, a game called Mickey Mania: The Timeless Adventures of Mickey Mouse. The game was an exploration of Mickey Mouse's animated history, from 1928's Steamboat Willie to 1990's The Prince and the Pauper. It was interesting and a solid concept for a game. It was even pretty well animated with nice colorful graphics, but it's also strangely devoid of actual fun. And when you think about those poor developers having to work under ol' Iron Fist Jaffe, and his partner Mike Guillaume, who both had zero tolerance for opinions that weren't their own, that makes perfect sense. But that was the era of Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and true 3D gaming was fast approaching. After Mickey Mania's dev team practically revolted following the game's completion, lodging complaints to Sony about Jaffe and Guillaume, they were both left on thin ice with Sony. So they shipped both men, along with Sony ImageSoft producer Alan Becker, to Utah on a trip to check out a company called Evans & Sutherland, to see if Sony could work with them on future projects for the upcoming PlayStation.
For more than 30 years, Evans & Sutherland has been the power behind the scenes, providing complete visualization solutions for a wide variety of applications.
Evans & Sutherland had already been deeply entrenched in the world of 3D graphics, and were known for their flight simulators that, for the time, were incredibly realistic. They were also working with a very early form of virtual reality, and that experience in particular opened Jaffe's eyes to greater possibilities in gaming.
The moment I'll never forget is when I was flying around this ship on Mars and I saw this dome city floating in the background. I asked the Evans & Sutherland guys, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, go check it out." That's when it clicked for me. The idea that the background was no longer just a background, it was a revelation.
As the men left Evans & Sutherland, they were in agreement. They needed to work within that world. They saw the kind of technology they wanted to use on their next project, but were lacking any actual ideas on how to use it. They returned to Hell on Earth, California, and were in a car together on the 405 when they found themselves stuck in heavy, dense traffic. Nobody seems to remember quite who said it first, but the trio found themselves fantasizing about having Mad Max-style weapons mounted on their car and annihilating every vehicle in their path. And that's it. That was the inception of the idea that would eventually become Twisted Metal. Rich Robinson, the head of Sony ImageSoft, approved of that general idea, alongside others Jaffe and Mike had come up with soon after. But now they needed to pitch those ideas to Sony's marketing department for the final green light. So nearly a month after visiting Evans and Sutherland, the two attended a meeting and pitched all their ideas. When Jaffe got to the one we would later know as Twisted Metal, what he said was, well, not very detailed or even eloquent, but it seemed to get the point across.
It's called Battle Cars. It's like Doom, but you're in cars. That's all I said.
And that's all it took from marketing to give the final okay to tell them to go off and make the game. Now, if you're hearing a sudden wailing off in the horizon somewhere, that's probably just the lamentations of today's game devs who don't quite experience the same level of ease. Pour one out for those homies. In 1995, a group of Evans and Sutherland employees splintered off and created a studio called SingleTrack. This was the team that would end up working with David Jaffe and Mike Guillaume for the two games they had gotten approved, Battle Cars and Warhawk. Being a newly founded studio with, technically, no proven track record, SingleTrack barely had enough employees to divvy up and work on the two games. SingleTrack co-founder and Twisted Metal producer Scott Campbell found it to be a scary but exciting time for his new company.
My thing was when I first got into the industry and I sat down with David Jaffe and, you know, I was coming from a very conservative engineering development environment, working with government and people that wear suits. It was very refreshing to see all these ideas just come pouring out, and I thought, oh my God, how am I gonna harness this? How am I gonna, you know, try to take this and you know, turn it into a production environment?
In fact, there may have been a few too many different ideas drifting in the ether at SingleTrack. Jaffe has talked about at least one time where he and the studio didn't quite see eye to eye.
And we were so excited, and we wrote up this big design document, and we sent this off to these guys. And about a week later, the guys in Utah sent us back this document, which was a pizza delivery game.
You're making a delivery, I'm making a delivery. We're just gonna have to see who gets there first.
Luckily, he and Mike talked the studio out of that idea. To make sure development went smoothly for both Warhawk and Battle Cars, SingleTrack needed Jaffe and Mike to each focus on just one of them, but they both wanted Battle Cars. So, they did as mankind has done since the dawn of time when faced with two decisions. They flipped a coin. Jaffe won the coin toss and chose Battle Cars, leaving Mike Guillaume with Warhawk, a kind of flight combat simulator for Sony's home console. Now, since I'm not gonna keep calling this damn thing Battle Cars for the next while, here's how the title Twisted Metal came to be.
Battle Cars was a placeholder name because there was already a Super Nintendo game named Battle Cars. Then it became Urban Assault, but Microsoft already had a game with that name. Then it became High Octane, but we couldn't get that either. This consultant producer named Andy Sells came up with the name Twisted Metal. I didn't love it.
Frankly, this Andy Sells guy seemed way better at titles than David Jaffe. Regardless, the type of game Jaffe's SingleTrack team was looking to craft had never quite been done before. They were going to have to undertake exhaustive research to determine what direction to go in, which, in this case, just meant playing tons of Mario Kart and Doom while figuring out what elements could be borrowed from each and combined into one abomination. Mortal Kombat had also inspired the project's direction, as it featured a cast of playable characters that were both colorful and memorable, each becoming household names among gamers. Jaffe wanted to replicate that as best they could, crafting deadly vehicles with distinct looks and unique weapons that would essentially become characters themselves. And it's worth noting that Jaffe learned from his previous experience making Mickey Mania. Twisted Metal was his baby, but SingleTrack had a huge stake in it as well. Their reputation as a new development studio hinged on its success, and this time Jaffe was going to collaborate with his team. That's where an artist named Lee R. Wilson comes in. He's responsible for the concept art that would soon become iconic characters for Sony's upcoming PlayStation, though he remains humble about it.
Really, it was David's ideas, but David couldn't draw, so he'd give me some ideas, and I'd come back with a bunch of options. I worked on most of the Twisted Metal games, and the direction given to me by David was always more sick and twisted.
But as we know thanks to Battle Cars, Jaffe's kinda crap at naming things. He and SingleTrack struggled to finalize any names for the vehicles they designed, but it was an outside party who came to their rescue.
Then one day my girlfriend, who later became my wife, saw a poster of the cars and said, "That's Yellow Jacket, that's Dark Side, and that's Sweet Tooth." They were great names. Even today, when I'm working on something, I'll ask her for help with naming stuff.
But above all others, there's one vehicle in particular that would come to represent Twisted Metal in the public eye. It suited Jaffe's tastes perfectly. A summertime staple. An ice cream truck, usually innocent and playing a chipper tune as it invites customers to come buy a tasty frozen treat. Except this one happened to be adorned with an explosive clown head on the roof and machine guns mounted on the front end, the typically cheerful visage now made ghoulish and menacing. If Pennywise ever appeared on Pimp My Ride, this monstrosity would be tailor-made for him.
Yo dog, you wanted a clown car? Well, we put a clown on your clown car. How sick is that?
I love you.
It's fitting then Stephen King himself inspired Sweet Tooth.
He came about because we kept coming back to this movie Stephen King directed called Maximum Overdrive, where a semi-truck had the Green Goblin's face on it. That spawned the idea of an ice cream truck with a clown on it. Because that car had a face on it, marketing chose that car for the cover. That's basically how he became the mascot of the franchise.
While progress was steadily being made, things weren't all sunshine and rainbows for the TM team. That previous fateful meeting with Sony's marketing department saw Jaffe's concept approved and given an $800,000 budget to work with. But their next meeting wasn't quite so uplifting. Singletrack showed off both Warhawk and Twisted Metal. One was received positively and in fact was raved about by those present. And it wasn't Twisted Metal. This would prove to be the case all throughout development. Anytime Twisted Metal was presented, it was compared unfavorably to other, prettier 3D games also planned to launch alongside the PlayStation. This was true even at the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3, where Ridge Racer and Wipeout drew all the attention from those interested in vehicle-focused games. According to Kellen Hatch, Singletrack's creative director at the time, the graphics were a major sticking point.
I remember when we showed the Sony executives in Japan the finished game, the first question they asked was, when are you going to replace the little boxes with cars?
And those who got actual hands-on time with Twisted Metal weren't exactly impressed either. From the day the team decided on their final vision for what their game would be, Jaffe started referring to it as a fighting game. You were controlling cars and trucks instead of martial artists or street brawlers, but regardless, Twisted Metal's development was still approached as if it were part of the same genre as Mortal Kombat. And so the majority of playtesters Sony assigned to Twisted Metal were most familiar with that genre. Jaffe talks a lot about a disastrous focus group as well, comprised of quote-unquote Street Fighter guys who had nothing positive to say. Whether or not the focus group and the playtesters were comprised of the same people, I'm not sure, but Jaffe had this to say about their feedback.
The focus group hated it. They couldn't stand Twisted Metal and they just loved Warhawk. They said Twisted Metal was stupid. I even remember calling my wife and saying that I'm going to have to find a new job because I thought it was going to fail.
Hey, yo.
To be fair, it didn't coalesce into the version we know until very close to its deadline. See, they were trying to push the very limits of the brand new PlayStation hardware by giving players one massive sandbox-style world in which they could wreak havoc and demolish their computer-controlled enemies. And it kinda sucked. Only 8 cars in total could be placed within a match, and just tracking them down within a massive level would only lead to a lot of downtime where no combat is happening. Never mind the fact that world was ultimately lifeless and devoid of interesting things to do. I mean, really, what is the point of having a massive, continuous, open world that takes ages to traverse when there's just no fun activities anywhere inside it? Wait a minute. I think a page from a different script got mixed in here somehow. Anywho, the large singular level was just not working for Twisted Metal. Especially when, once you defeated the final enemy on the map, that was it. Game over. This made the whole package feel short and incredibly shallow. But the game had existed in that form for a year, and altering it in any way would fundamentally change the way Singletrack viewed it. It was a dilemma that Jaffe especially agonized over. Finally, only a month and a half before the game would be stocked on store shelves, the decision was made to divide that level into 4 smaller ones. Freeway for All, Warehouse District Warfare, River Park Rumble, and Arena Duel. They would then add 2 more levels to the mix, Assault on Cyberbia and Rooftop Combat. But that alone likely still wouldn't have been enough to make their game a worthwhile purchase for anyone who just bought their nice new PlayStation. Because believe it or not, there had also been no multiplayer implemented. There's been a couple different explanations for how the split-screen mode came to be. Jaffe has been quoted as saying they just threw it in for the hell of it near the end of development just to see how it played, only to realize it was a literal game changer and provided much more fun and replayability than the single-player mode. Scott Campbell has a different recollection.
It was a contractual obligation from Sony, so it was always going to be in the game. But we didn't think much about it until toward the end, when I assigned it to 2 engineers and 1 graphics modeler. Surprisingly, the multiplayer became one of the real strengths of the game.
So things were finally coming together. But you may remember that Jaffe's initial goal was to tell a story. But how would that work in this case? Well, now the single-player aspect was comprised of a series of arena battles with a zany but simple premise motivating the player. It's Christmas Eve 2005, and you were invited to participate in the Twisted Metal car combat tournament run by the mysterious Calypso, a man who will grant any single wish made by the winner. Players could pick their vehicle, each driven by a character with a short bio explaining who they are and what they want. You then battle through multiple death matches and finally a boss fight. Defeating the boss then rewards the player with a bunch of scrolling text, revealing the character's wish and the consequences thereafter, and maybe a very short and simple animation in 1 or 2 cases. And they sucked. No matter the character you chose, those incredibly brief and half-assed endings were never satisfying nor worth unlocking. But that's not quite the level of storytelling Jaffe originally had in mind. He envisioned a world where this deadly contest takes place, taking lives and potentially leveling whole neighborhoods just so one person could get their wish at the end of it all. A wish that wouldn't exactly pan out as expected. And we would see it all presented in live-action cutscenes that would serve as the true reward for fighting through the single-player mode as each character. Finally, Jaffe got his chance to write and direct, telling not just one, but multiple stories, driven entirely by his creative vision with no interference. A set was made, actors were hired, and the cameras rolled, and every ending Jaffe made was an absolute cinematic train wreck. Each one a complete, jaw-dropping disaster unto themselves. From dialogue, to acting, to direction, every aspect showed an incredible overestimation of talent and ability, and they're an absolute hilarious joy to watch.
You said it would be easy. Do you know what they did? Do you? Now it's my turn. It's my world. It's my word. It's my turn. It's my day. Boo.
Cuckoo.
You're the winner, and the money is your prize.
No, my prize is getting close enough to you to do this. I've been paid by the people of LA to take you out, Calypso.
You know, if you really want to be an assassin, you should keep your eyes on your prey.
I wasn't trying for that vibe. I was genuinely trying to make interesting little Twilight Zone type stories for each character with a be careful what you wish for twist to it. But Sony thought they were terrible, so they cut all the endings from the game.
$80,000 of Singletrack's budget went to their creation, just to be tossed in a dumpster. But there's more to the story than that. As David Jaffe would explain in an interview with YouTuber Genry Perez, yet another focus group was assembled by Sony to judge the merits of those live-action endings. Consisting of teenagers and young adults, aka the game's target audience, whose word should be gospel here, this focus group overwhelmingly approved of the sheer cheesiness and low-budget charm of what they saw. Instead, Jaffe was blindsided to learn that employees of Singletrack itself, including key members of the Twisted Metal team who were irreplaceable, were vehemently against their inclusion in the final game. Remember, the studio was based in Utah, a state with a large Mormon community, and when these team members learned of the sexual content in those endings, particularly Calypso's harem of barely dressed supermodels, they put their foot down and threatened to walk away. And so those movies were removed and replaced with new, seemingly hastily written text-based endings instead. While the development cycle of Twisted Metal was relatively short by today's standards, I think it's fair to say it was rocky at best. Nobody was quite sure how it would perform once released, though Jaffe was fairly certain it wouldn't do well. And who could blame him? After that first disastrous focus group, as well as being forced to cut the one aspect that got the most praise. So the game was probably going to flop. And since there certainly wouldn't be a second Twisted Metal, and Singletrack was offered a deal to make another title for Sony, Jaffe began conceptualizing other projects, one of which was a strange bug combat game featuring tarantulas versus crickets. But against the odds, Twisted Metal surpassed all expectations when it released shortly after the US launch of the PlayStation. People couldn't wait to get their hands on that chonky old PS1 game with the evil clown's ice cream truck on the cover, set ablaze with fire. It ended up selling 1.12 million units and earned itself a Green Label Greatest Hits re-release down the road. That may be nowhere close to Resident Evil's 2.75 million, but it's definitely nothing to sneeze at. More than that, it gained some measure of critical acclaim and was even named Game of the Year by Electronic Gaming Monthly. Considering this was a game that was seemingly hated by everyone who got their hands on it during development, that's an incredible accomplishment. And suddenly, Twisted Metal 2 was on the table after all. For me, the original Twisted Metal isn't a game I revisit often. Since I was a wee lad at the time, given very limited access to my older brother's PlayStation, I didn't get a lot of hands-on time with it. And with 3D gaming being such a new thing that even game developers had some trouble wrapping their heads around, I don't know if I ever really figured out the controls back then. But I did try. Because while Twisted Metal wasn't a graphically polished game, there was just something so ridiculously inherently cool about it. The case alone always drew my eye. That image of Sweet Tooth is still what comes to mind whenever I'm talking about the ice cream truck or even its driver, Needles Kane. And while I wasn't really capable of playing it very well or for any decent length of time, I definitely watched my brother play it whenever I was allowed to sit off to the side and stare at the mayhem happening on screen. As an adult revisiting it, it definitely feels bare bones. The concept was there and they were clearly onto something, but I still don't quite gel with that original game. And as I mentioned earlier, the endings just don't feel worth unlocking. But there's one aspect I adore about it, that the sequel's abandoned altogether, and that's the first-person interior vehicle perspective you can switch to. They didn't cheap out and just have first-person mode consist of a camera perspective placed on the hood of the car. No, they went to the effort of designing a unique interior for every vehicle that shows the driver's hands on the steering wheel. Was it totally unnecessary? Absolutely. Is it the most efficient way to play the game? Hell no, you can't see what the hell's going on most of the time. And yet I freaking love it, and I choose to play the game exclusively in first-person mode because I just love it so much.
Style. Sophistication. The ability to launch napalm into oncoming traffic. If these are the things you look for in an automobile, it's time you test drive Twisted Metal 2. Fully automated weaponry, dual rocket launchers, and the new APS flamethrowing system. All standard. Drive the 1997 Twisted Metal 2 on PlayStation from Sony, and let style be your weapon.
The team behind Twisted Metal paid close attention to all the feedback they got once the game released. It did well, but was also far from perfect, and they wanted to improve upon the original now that Twisted Metal 2 was going into production.
I mean, the first one is very much sort of like, we always compare it to sort of like a GarageBand version of, you know, what ultimately the game ended up being, which is Twisted Metal 2. The first one had all the heart that we wanted it to have, but it lacked a lot in terms of presentation, gameplay, things like that. But it wasn't until the second one that we were really able to make the game everything that we originally intended to make.
Jaffe witnessed firsthand how the general audience struggled with the controls, having watched people play TM1 on demo kiosks at department stores. Far too many people were slamming into walls or getting stuck in corners, so this became the #1 thing he wanted to address in the next iteration. For a brief period of time, they toyed with the idea of setting TM2 farther in the future in order to feature hover cars that could easily move in all directions, making movement feel closer to something like Doom or Wolfenstein 3D. Creative director Kellen Hatch even recalls that they considered creating cars with insect legs for a different style of movement, a potential holdover from Jaffe's abandoned Bug Combat game. Ultimately, they stuck with more traditional cars like the first, and simply did a full revamp of the overall control scheme for them. One additional important tweak came when they decided to let the cars rotate on a dime when they were stationary, allowing players to more precisely line up shots with their weapons. Thankfully, Jaffe's idea for new weapon controls were never implemented though, because several weapon pickup types from the first game were rarely used by players, such as the oil slick and catapults. He wanted to scale back the number of pickups and dedicate a shoulder button to each. For example, if players picked up a homing missile, they would have to remember R1 fires it. Pick up a power missile, and only L1 would fire that, etc., etc. It sounds terrible, and completely counterproductive to intense, in-the-moment gameplay. Luckily, those plans changed on October 3rd, 1995. A number of people were gathered in a Sony conference room watching TV as America awaited the O.J. Simpson trial's verdict. It was then that Twisted Metal assistant producer Hunter Luisi explained his idea for the weapons. Calling back to the idea that Twisted Metal was meant to be a fighting game in cars, Luisi suggested they simply add Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter-esque advanced attacks to the game using button combos. The idea was met with skepticism, but upon testing it, it added exactly the right kind of extra variety, and also introduced a new layer of skill-based gameplay to the multiplayer aspect. So the first game's freeze missiles and drop mines were changed from pickups to advanced attacks, and were joined by several others such as an energy shield and limited invisibility. I especially love the rear attack, which lets you shoot weapons behind you toward any unwanted dingleberries. Lord knows I've had too many of those. But no fighting game sequel is complete without a new cast of characters appearing alongside old favorites, and even those returning oldies had a new twist. TM2 introduced the tradition of having previous vehicles return with all new drivers, though Needles Kane was, and continues to be, the only driver of Sweet Tooth. Though, the name Sweet Tooth has become interchangeable with the driver and the vehicle over the years. Out of the new crop of characters included in TM2, my personal favorite, and my second favorite character in the series overall, is Axel. Mainly because Axel is both the driver and the vehicle, being a man forcibly attached to a ridiculous machine by his cruel father. In my opinion, Axel was always the perfect example of what made Twisted Metal so damn cool. This design is equal parts unique and insane. We all know that realistically, within seconds, these tires would be popped, and Axel himself would be ripped through by all manner of weapons with this contraption offering him zero protection. It's dumb and impractical, and I absolutely love it. In fact, I spent years of my life building my own, only to finish and realize I got the dimensions totally wrong. It wasn't a complete loss though. I traded it to the paperboy for a box of comics. Yeah, nobody parks on the street anymore. As for how the character design process goes on one of these games, Scott Campbell laid it out simply.
Cars would get designed first, and then characters, we would talk about cool, compelling, weird, wacky type of characters. And that was just kind of a process of applying those different characters to the different cars. And that was always a fun process, and one that really endured a lot of changes throughout the development.
But for TM2 to truly shine brighter than the first, its level design would also have to be a little more complex. The first game's arenas served their purpose. They gave players a handful of different locations to battle it out with other cars, but there was minimal interactivity with the environments themselves, aside from utilizing ramps or dodging shots from police officers. They wanted to be far more ambitious with each arena, and the World Tour concept for TM2 gave Singletrack plenty of material to work with. See, one day during a Singletrack staff meeting, Scott Campbell started sketching out an idea in his notebook. It began as a simple grid of streets, and the idea gradually became more fleshed out until finally he drew the Eiffel Tower at one end. Campbell envisioned a PS1 approximation of Paris, in which players could get to the top of the Eiffel Tower and set remote bombs to blow it up. This would then dynamically change the entire level, with debris from the tower creating new access ramps to the building rooftops and opening up new strategies for players to utilize.
I remember when you looked at the level and we started reviewing it, and I remember Jaffe saying, dude, if you could make this thing work the way that you're saying it could work, we gotta do it.
As it turns out, Paris would drive the development of TM2 in a new, bold direction. Because the graphics of the PlayStation weren't exactly photorealistic, Campbell didn't really think the destruction of the tower would be controversial. If there's one thing I've learned these past few years, it's to never underestimate humanity's ability to be offended by anything and everything. Singletrack learned that the hard way when a member of the French press came to preview the game. Campbell recalled that this reporter was highly offended the moment he saw the Eiffel Tower collapse into a fiery heap. And that reaction only drove Singletrack to create more opportunities to decimate treasured monuments from around the globe. As for the single-player experience, Jaffe got a second crack at writing the character endings, and thankfully nobody let Jaffe behind the camera again.
You know the deal, Calypso. I signed your contract. Let's get this over with.
Gentlemen, I'm not the one who kidnapped your girlfriend, but as promised, she is here. Perfectly safe.
Bruce! Bruce! What's happening?
This time the endings were presented with Lee R. Wilson's striking art, animated in a motion comic style that would later become very popular in the gaming industry, especially amongst indie devs.
We demand that you give us the ability to fly!
Certainly.
That is so cool!
Congratulations! I have granted your wish. Have a great time in the friendly skies.
Let's go! Wahoo! Hey man, this can't be right.
Good thing these first-class tickets are refundable.
He got a chance to properly flesh out his idea for the monkey's paw, be careful what you wish for vision he had from the beginning. A couple still skew a bit too silly or hokey, but there's no doubt that Jaffe's writing was sharper and wittier this time around. Overall, TM2 finally offered a satisfying reward for completing the game as each and every character. TM2 would go on to sell 1.74 million copies in the US, outperforming the original game. I don't think anyone can or would deny that Twisted Metal 2 is objectively better than the first in nearly every way. It has a great cast of characters and vehicles, the controls are massively improved, the weapon selection is better and more useful overall, the advanced attacks add great depth to matches, and the level design is pretty damn cool. This is arguably Twisted Metal at its absolute peak, making the original game feel like a hollow tech demo in comparison. I do miss my precious dashboard camera, and the AI enemies love to spam the freeze missile a bit too much, but this is a damn good game. There's a reason it's still considered the best in the series. It balances all of its components very well. TM2 got countless hours of playtime from my brother and his friends after it released. I have very distinct memories of watching them pass the controllers around while playing split-screen versus, and freaking out when they discovered a new secret hidden inside a level. If there's one real complaint I have, it's that the graphics aren't all that improved. It's prettier for sure. Barely. It's kinda like plopping a wig on a donkey though. And graphics aside, it holds up well because this thing is just as fun as it was back in the day. I didn't realize how much I missed this genre until I started revisiting Twisted Metal for this video. And the fact that this type of bombastic and wacky car combat doesn't really exist anymore is just one reason why I've become disinterested in modern gaming. You know, along with all the crooked publishers, broken games, and live service nonsense.
My name is Calypso. Exactly 1 year ago on Christmas Eve, my Twisted Metal contest destroyed the City of Angels. There will be no safe zones this year, no places to hide. In the next 24 hours, the entire world will know my name. They will see my beautiful work of art firsthand. No one will be safe. I promise you that. Good luck, driver. Welcome to Twisted Metal.
There's another obscure piece of Twisted Metal lore that's usually forgotten. Sony partnered with DC Comics in 1996 to promote the release of TM2 with a 16-page comic explaining the backstory of the mysterious Calypso and his tournament. It was written by Jamie Delano rather than Jaffe himself. You may know Delano from his work on Hellblazer from 1988 to 1991, which was John Constantine's first solo book. Phil Hester drew the TM2 comics artwork and would go on to co-create the DC character Mia Dearden, which was later adapted into the character Thea Dearden Queen for the Arrow TV show. The comic book itself is an interesting look at the world of Twisted Metal. It may or may not be canon to TM2. It was officially endorsed by Sony, but wasn't written by Jaffe, and also doesn't quite match up with story details from the game. Even so, it majorly shines a light on the life of Calypso, starting with him as a child who accidentally pancakes his sister with family car, all the way through adulthood as he causes the deaths of those closest to him while he himself survives unlikely circumstances, eventually becoming a demolition derby driver, as you do. Following a dark series of events, he attempts to drive his car into a brick wall, only realizing seconds before impact that his young daughter was in the back seat. Calypso successfully dies and goes to hell, discovering the devil's own personal demolition derby. The devil then offers to send Calypso back to the living world if he runs a deadly tournament that'll inevitably send the souls of talented drivers down to hell to compete in hell's own version of Twisted Metal. Calypso agrees. It's alright. Maybe even kinda cool, but I never really wanted to know more about Calypso. At the very least, there's a brief but dark moment that explains the Twisted Metal tournament's place in the world. It's widely reviled, and obviously illegal, but there's no stopping it. A particularly violent moment sees a Twisted Metal protest in New York City get steamrolled and exploded by the contestants themselves. Good luck obtaining a copy for your collection, cause only 100 were ever printed. But I guess now I can't delay this any longer. Oh hey, did I mention the first Twisted Metal game had a Tiger Electronic release? I don't think I did. That's, well, I mean, it's a Tiger handheld release. Okay, look, I really can't delay any longer. Let's talk about Twisted Metal 3.
Psst, did you hear? Sweet Tooth got parole today.
Yeah, I thought that clown was in for life. Sweet Tooth got out today.
He's probably living the high life.
Circuses, birthday parties.
No, actually, he's driving an ice cream truck.
Get out of town.
Sweet Tooth is back in Twisted Metal 3 with enough weapons to make any angry driver happy.
You go, Sweet Tooth.
Twisted
By 1997, Single Track had been transformed from a fledgling, unproven game studio to a powerhouse that delivered 4 hits in 4 years for Sony's PlayStation: Warhawk, Twisted Metal, Twisted Metal 2, and Jet Moto. From the outside looking in, it'd be easy to assume its employees were riding high on this continued wave of success, but that wasn't the case. An air of unrest began to sweep through the studio. It was a near-unanimous opinion that Sony wasn't doing enough to reward them for their hard work. Twisted Metal had been a particularly stressful and draining experience during development, and the team had immediately gone right back to work on its sequel. And while TM2 had been a more positive experience for those involved, they had also undergone intense crunch times that meant sidelining their families and personal lives. And coming out on the other side, feeling like it wasn't entirely worth it, was a bitter pill to swallow.
Doing Twisted Metal 1 and Twisted Metal 2 took an enormous toll on myself and the rest of the team. And to really not have any financial upside that as a result of that really started to I think affect myself and the rest of the team. We put so much time and effort into these titles, and now they were seeing decent success, with Twisted Metal 2 being a $1 million+ seller. We started to have conversations of, wow, this really sucks to pour your heart and soul into something, put your family on the back burner, and at the end of the day, what did you get from it? Well, a reputation for making a good, fun car combat game. That wasn't enough going forward, and I think that really started the start of the exodus.
And so, even though Sony wanted a third Twisted Metal, Single Track made the shocking decision to walk away from their partnership and seek new opportunities and have more control over their projects. While Single Track had only made 4 games, their success within the industry meant that anyone would be lucky to work with the young studio. And very soon after splintering from Sony, someone else came knocking. Before long, they would find themselves working on another car combat game, utilizing all that previous experience while also being allowed creative freedom to expand gameplay in ways Sony may have thought too risky. It was called Critical Depth, essentially a submarine deathmatch game that, frankly, I can't find a lot of behind-the-scenes information about. It exists, and released in 1997, yet the people who worked on it either never really mention it or outright pretend it never happened. Regardless, Critical Depth played entirely differently to Twisted Metal, and honestly, just isn't that fun. Single Track stepped outside their comfort zone with underwater combat, and it didn't pay off, but their next title would be a true return to form. That game would become Rogue Trip Vacation 2012.
We were really apprehensive going into this development. It was also very hard to see Sony continue on with the Twisted Metal franchise internally without our team and without Jaffe. I think it really showcased how difficult it is for a new team to take over an established franchise. It is still undisputed that Twisted Metal 3 and 4 were the worst offerings of the franchise.
But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Sadly, Single Track's time with the franchise ended after TM2, and David Jaffe, who had grown tired of being an outsider working with third-party studios over long distances, decided to join a studio within Sony directly, beginning work on a game called Dark Guns. Sony instead handed Twisted Metal over to an internal team called 989 Studios, located in California. 989 had recently released a racing game called Rallycross at the beginning of 1997, and so Sony trusted them to quickly enter development on TM3, using that game's driving and physics engine to get the ball rolling. Unfortunately for them, their experience with Rallycross wouldn't be much help for them on this new high-profile project, because as we all know, the first 2 entries were never seen as driving games by Single Track. Twisted Metal 1 and 2 were designed to be fighting games in cars, and 989 wasn't properly equipped to handle that. Rallycross had been known for its relative realism, the way each vehicle's suspension behaved on each bump in the track, and how cars would tumble and roll over sandy hills if the player made a turn poorly. That engine just wasn't right for a Twisted Metal game, but that's what 989 had to work with since its team didn't have Single Track's experience or existing assets, and Sony wasn't being lenient on this one. As Michael Riccio, a programmer on TM3, would later recall, They had only 8 to 10 months to finish the latest sequel and get it on store shelves. The pressure was on, and sadly, the deck was stacked against them from the very start. And the truth is, there's not that much info out there about the actual development of Twisted Metal 3. What is extremely notable, however, is the soundtrack, which was done by Rob Zombie and Pitch Shifter, and would go on to become the bane of every Twisted Metal Let's Player's existence. This music perfectly suits the world of Twisted Metal and adds an extra oomph to every match. The graphics are also a considerable upgrade over the previous two, though it does come at the expense of some of the grittiness fans had come to expect, and the art style was an interesting shift for the series. And while they're often forgotten, there were several innovations introduced here. The presentation was overhauled and is much more striking. Instead of the character select screen simply showing off the vehicles and its driver, you now actively watch them participating in an ongoing battle. Plus, the character bios were now fully voiced, immediately giving you a better sense of who they are and what they want.
When I finally freed myself, I was permanently disfigured. My torment was not over. I'm climbing back into my machine. When I win, I will finally be free.
It's just a crying shame that most of them are extremely dull. For the single player, gamers now had the option to choose a computer-controlled ally to fight alongside them throughout the tournament. The endings also featured a new art style and were animated in CG, though they're a bit janky. But the intro kicks ass. I just can't properly play any of it due to the aforementioned copyright issues. And as for multiplayer, TM3 finally allowed 4 players to spam each other with freeze missiles locally in split-screen mode, thanks to the PlayStation's multi-tap peripheral. Plus, overall, it benefits from being able to use the left analog stick of the DualShock controller to move the vehicles. Though I guess by that point, most PlayStation users had a nice D-pad-shaped callus on their thumbs anyway. I would have, if I had thumbs. None of those improvements were enough to please critics or fans. Twisted Metal 3 released in November 1998, exclusively in North America, this time never launching in Europe or Japan. It sold 1.14 million copies. Far fewer than TM2, and not much more than the original. But considering it only released in one region, that's actually pretty impressive. And it was among the best-selling games in the last quarter of 1998, and technically, it is the most profitable entry in the series, according to David Jaffe. I know, right? Critics lambasted it at the time for a multitude of reasons. Some thought it was still too similar to the first two, without being an actual improvement, while others noted lackluster level design, and near universally the new physics were hated. It was considered mediocre at best. But the true salt in the wound was the fact that Rogue Trip, the title single track created after their submarine game and was the culmination of years of experience, had released a few weeks earlier that same year. By this point, the car combat genre had lost its luster with critics after it had exploded in popularity thanks to Twisted Metal. Hell, the genre would even see Star Wars and WWE titles later on. But even so, damn near everyone comparing Rogue Trip with Twisted Metal 3 preferred the former. And to this day, it's not even close. As for what David Jaffe thinks of TM3, well, see for yourself.
I was wondering if you would mind signing my favorite Twisted Metal game for me. Could you do that? Do you have a Sharpie around here?
See, you're shaking, and you shouldn't, because... So, here's the thing. This is your favorite one.
Yeah, it's my favorite, Twisted Metal 3. It's great.
See, this is the problem. I'm in a bit of a conundrum. Maybe you can help me as a programmer and understand his logic. I can sign it, which I will, and I'll make you happy, and I'll give you that. The problem is, it'll call into question my judgment in hiring you, because clearly you're a fool. And so, which would you rather have, the job or the signed Twisted Metal?
But at the same time, he can be charitable about the subject too.
So you're not a fan of this game then?
You know what, honestly, yes and no. First off, anytime you ship anything that runs, it's a cause for celebration because it's hard to make a game. Okay, new team coming onto a franchise that had already been established by another team, and in that short amount of time, it's hard to really jump on the bandwagon of bashing this. Plus, it's sold great. If you go online, there are people who have affinity for this one.
As a kid, I remember playing this one way more than TM2. As much as it looks like some sort of eldritch abomination, I loved the new Sweet Tooth model, and honestly, that was enough for me to like the game back then. I was still super young after all. I wasn't playing these games expecting to beat the single player or even win against my brother in multiplayer. Didn't have those kinds of skills. I would just play it to have fun for about 30 minutes at a time here and there. As an adult, I do see the problems. Major ones. Hell, my two favorite characters, Sweet Tooth and Axel, are both nearly unplayable at times. Sweet Tooth will not stay upright. It flips and rolls every time it turns or hits a bump the wrong way. Suddenly, I'm not a crazy clown in an ice cream truck flinging napalm at grandma. Instead, I'm a helpless turtle upside down in the road, ready to get flattened into a frisbee. And as for Axel, the steering just feels way off in general, but for him, they're especially touchy, and it makes playing as him a miserable, wobbly experience. There was also a new gimmick where, sporadically throughout the single-player mode, cars you defeated in a match will suddenly respawn unless you perform absurdly specific, frustrating, and obtuse actions on those levels. And it's just as fun as it sounds. Ergo, not at all. Though I do appreciate the AI partner as an option in single-player, it's just a fun variation to play from time to time. But the endings for TM3 are particularly weak and unimaginative.
Mr. Grimm, you've snatched every soul on the planet but mine. Now you want my soul? Your wish is granted. I am Calypso, and I thank you for playing Twisted Metal.
And while I like a couple of the character designs, others are just not great. And even the good ones are ruined in some way. I was such a dumb babby that I actually thought this version of Mr. Grimm was cool back then.
My hunger for souls is now insatiable. I've had my fill of mortals. Now I want to feast on the darkest, most powerful soul imaginable. I will become all-powerful. There will be no escaping my wrath.
Yeah, I know, but cut me a break. I probably still thought Barney was cool too. Seriously though, this character should sound like Tony freaking Todd.
Be my victim. I am the writing on the wall.
Not Smeagol's asthmatic cousin Shecky with the wonky lip. What the hell? Ugh, anyway. Keep in mind, I don't think it's terrible or anything, but with my two favorite characters being completely unfun to play, there's just not much reason for me to revisit it often, or ever again. Aside from the graphics and the 4-player multiplayer, TM2 was just better in nearly every way.
Pop the hood! The hood!
Twisted Metal 4, and Sweet Tooth is large and in charge with all the high-octane attitude you've come to know and love.
989 Studios.
While Jaffe recalls having 1 or 2 meetings with 989 at the very beginning of TM3's development, so far as I can tell, he had 0 involvement in the creation of Twisted Metal 4. It definitely feels different from the previous games right away, with the intro providing an all-new origin for the Twisted Metal tournament, now shown as a traveling attraction that's been around since the invention of automobiles. TM4 also shakes up the premise, showing Sweet Tooth overthrowing Calypso to become the new ringleader of the whole shebang, even employing a small army of clown minions. Where they came from? Hell if I know. And, well, there's not a lot more to say about it. 989 clearly took the criticisms of the previous game to heart and made various improvements. It also remixed the formula a bit, as every match in the single-player mode now ends with a boss fight, with Sweet Tooth himself serving as the final baddie. It's also noteworthy that Calypso is a contestant now, trying to win back his tournament. This game also allows players to build custom cars, choosing from a small list of options to make unique vehicles to use, which, I have to admit, is a pretty great idea. The soundtrack once again features Rob Zombie, along with other bands like Cypress Hill and Scold. Yet again, it's one of the best parts of the game and very fitting for the series. And again, it's a pain in the butt to try to stream this on YouTube. Twisted Metal 4 released at the end of 1999, and unsurprisingly, reviewed better than the third game. That's not to say critics, or gamers for that matter, loved it. It was actually met with a kind of reluctant positivity. Like being the prettiest contestant in a beauty pageant for pigs. Yeah, sure, you won, but your ass is still gonna get thumped and turned into bacon tomorrow.
That'll do, pig. That'll do.
I cannot tell you how much it pains me to admit this, but TM4 was actually my favorite as a kid. I know. I thought I would have been a more refined, discerning customer by 1999, but apparently not. I just remember getting a kick out of Sweet Tooth being the focus of the story, although I don't think he ever speaks a single line, which, after what they did with him in Twisted Metal 3...
I scream, you scream, we all scream for me! Gather round, kiddies, and let me show you just how sweet I can be!
May have been an act of mercy. And also, I may have liked it just because this was my Twisted Metal. My brother didn't own it first. I did, and I probably took a weird kind of pride in that. As an adult, I can see that there's still nothing here that wasn't done better in Twisted Metal 2, but there are definitely things to enjoy, particularly when compared to Part 3. TM4 generally feels much better to play. The physics still aren't great. In fact, they seem a little worse since I kept getting stuck on absolutely nothing. Enemies also occasionally have the same problem. But the controls lost the horrible wibbly-wobbliness of TM3. Playing Axel doesn't threaten you with motion sickness anymore, though Sweet Tooth still likes to beg for belly rubs. But at least the vehicles immediately reset when they flip over now, as opposed to the brief delay you faced in the previous game. I'm much more likely to replay this one and just skip TM3 in the future. I also enjoy the weapon selection this time around. There's an increased emphasis on setting explosives, with a freeze bomb and proximity mine being added alongside the classic Rumo bombs. The level design still skews slightly boring, but there's a couple of neat ones with some unique features. Hell, it was pretty fun discovering a haunted house in the carnival level, and that alone was more imaginative than anything in TM3. The oil rig is big, complex, and fun to explore. There's also a level set in a bedroom, with all the cars suddenly shrunken down to Hot Wheels size, so you can drive on plastic tracks and on the surface of furniture. That and the level's boss, RC Car, unintentionally foreshadowed a later entry in the series. Character selection in general is just crap though, and I mean that for vehicles and drivers. 989 was seriously scraping the bottom of the barrel here. A pizza delivery car and a station wagon? Really? And now we also have futuristic/alien vehicles. Most of them are either incredibly boring, or just don't feel like they belong in Twisted Metal. And why is Mr. Grimm a flamboyant pirate now? Plus, Rob Zombie is just a whole-ass character in the game. Unfortunately, boss characters don't get unique single-player endings, sharing a generic one instead, which is especially frustrating since it feels like half the roster are unlockable bosses, including Sweet Tooth and Axel. And while I like the idea of creating a custom car, the feature is so undercooked here that I'm surprised they bothered at all. So yeah, it's more fun and better polished than TM3. That's not saying much, but it may be worth a play. Actually, Baffled, Part 4 is both phobic and ableist because...
On March 16, 2005, 6 key members of the Twisted Metal Harbor City team were killed when their plane crashed following a celebratory skiing trip in Colorado.
The windows are shaking, pictures are falling off the wall. It's just unbelievable.
But nowhere in that sentence do I say, the only way you're going to get sex is underhanded trickery. I get this gun, I got a ton of bullets, and I'm going to shoot that till it's gone.